Okay, let's just get right into it. When you think of the man who essentially invented modern science, you probably have a very specific image in your head. You're picturing a peaceful, super wise old guy in a big white wig just sitting under an apple tree in a quiet orchard, waiting for gravity to literally fall right into his lap. It's a nice, comforting story, right? It's a widely accepted myth. But the truth? The truth is vastly more fascinating and honestly, a little terrifying. Today, in this explainer, we're going to strip away that highly sanitized textbook version of history. We're going to uncover the incredibly dark, gritty, and borderline chaotic reality of Sir Isaac Newton's actual life.
Because on one side, you've got textbook Newton, the ultimate symbol of pure, rational thought. But the real Newton, well, he was a man who was deeply paranoid, endlessly vengeful, and, get this, a secret alchemist who spent decades actively breaking the law in a smoky backyard shed. We really need to tear down that pristine, wig-wearing icon and introduce you to the bizarre, incredibly eccentric, and fiercely isolated hermit he truly was behind closed doors.
To understand how he became this way, we have to look at how his life started, because it was rough. Newton was born on Christmas Day in 1642, right in the middle of a freezing English Civil War. He was a premature baby, born so shockingly tiny that his own mother said he could fit into a single one-quart mug. Honestly, nobody expected him to survive the night. His biological father was already dead before he was even born, and then, at just 3 years old, his mother abandoned him. She got a marriage proposal from a wealthy 63-year-old minister who explicitly told her he wanted a wife, but absolutely did not want her toddler. So she just left young Isaac behind to go start a completely new family.
Now, you can probably guess the kind of abandonment leaves a mark. It deeply, deeply scarred him. He grew up fundamentally unable to trust anyone, utterly terrified of rejection, and just boiling with internal anger. When he was 19, he actually kept a secret journal where he listed all his sins. Sin number 13 is genuinely chilling. He wrote about sitting in his room actively fantasizing about burning his mother and his hated stepfather alive while they slept. I mean, this isn't just teenage angst. This is visceral trauma manifesting as violent, unchecked rage. So unsurprisingly, he was a total loner. His family tried to make him a farmer, but he was completely useless at it. He'd literally let the sheep wander off and get lost while he was busy reading books or building little miniature watermills in a stream. And of course, the quiet, weird kid got bullied. One day on his way to school, a bully kicked him incredibly hard in the stomach. Most kids would cry or run away. Newton didn't. He calmly waited until after school, challenged the guy to a fight, and absolutely brutalized him. He dragged this bully by the ears and violently scraped his face across the rough stone of a church wall. And then, just out of pure, unadulterated spite, he decided he was going to dominate this kid academically too, rising from the very bottom of the class to become the undisputed top student in the entire school. Because of this strange, almost spite-fueled genius, he gets sent off to Trinity College, Cambridge. But it wasn't some glamorous academic arrival. He entered as a subsizar, which basically meant he was a servant student. To pay for his tuition, he had to shine the shoes and empty the chamber pots of the wealthy aristocratic students. It was humiliating, he was completely isolated, and he made zero friends. Instead, he just stayed awake for days on end, skipping meals, completely obsessing over mathematics. He quickly realized that the university's core teachings, which were based on 2,000-year-old ideas from Aristotle, were total nonsense. So he just discarded all of them in this frantic, solitary pursuit of the actual truth. And when I say he pursued the truth, I mean he took it to insane extremes. Newton wanted to know how human vision worked, but he didn't just sit around writing a theory. He took a bodkin, which is a long, thick, blunt metal sewing needle, and literally slid it deep behind his own eyeball, right into his eye socket. While this chunk of metal was wedged against his skull bone, he pressed hard on the back of his own eye just to see what kind of colored shapes would pop up in his vision. He willingly risked total permanent blindness, casually wrote down his findings, pulled the needle out, and just went about his day. So what do you think happens when a mind that is this intensely obsessive is left completely alone? Well, in 1665, the bubonic plague hits, and Newton is forced into quarantine at a quiet country farmhouse. For 18 months, totally isolated from the outside world, he experiences his year of wonders. He literally invents calculus from scratch. He proves that white light is actually made of a full spectrum of colors. He maps out the fundamental laws of motion. Oh, and he theorizes universal gravity. The single greatest intellectual leap in the entire history of science was achieved by a guy sitting totally alone in his house, just trying to avoid a plague. Which actually brings us to the most famous story of them all, Did an apple really bonk him on the head and spark a magical eureka moment? Nope. Sorry to burst the bubble, but the apple myth is actually a classic piece of old man's self-promotion that Newton himself spread much later in his life to sound cool. What really happened is he just looked out his window, saw an apple fall into the mud, and started wondering why it fell straight down instead of sideways or up. He deduced that there's an invisible pulling force in all matter and realized that the exact same force stretching from the ground to the tree must also stretch all the way out into space to the moon, keeping it locked in orbit.
But here is the absolute craziest part of all this. What did Newton do after fundamentally decoding the physics of the universe? He took his brilliant, world-changing notes, shoved them into a desk drawer, and told almost absolutely no one. He hid them away for years. Why? Because he was still utterly terrified of human interaction and specifically of criticism. He hated the idea of other scientists debating or arguing with him so much that he preferred to just keep the universe's greatest secrets locked away in the dark.
And honestly, when he finally did publish, his absolute worst fears came true. Another really brilliant scientist named Robert Hooke criticized some of his work on light. Newton couldn't handle it. He suffered an intense mental breakdown and basically withdrew into total isolation for over a decade. Later on, when Hooke publicly claimed that he had helped Newton with some of the math for gravity, Newton unleashed a petty, decades-long vendetta. He systematically went through and erased every single mention of Hooke's name from his masterwork, the Principia. And years later, when Newton became president of the Royal Society, Robert Hooke's only official portrait mysteriously vanished. Most historians today believe Newton personally threw it into a fire just to ensure his rival's face was erased from history forever.
And Hooke wasn't even his only victim. German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz independently invented calculus, and unlike Newton, Leibniz actually went ahead and published it first. Well, Newton was enraged. He ruthlessly used his immense power as president of the Royal Society to set up an independent committee to investigate who the true inventor was. But here's the catch. Newton secretly wrote the entire official report himself. He packed it with fake evidence, signed other people's names to it, and officially framed Leibniz as a total fraud. He successfully ruined the man's reputation, letting Leibniz die in absolute poverty and disgrace, all while Newton openly gloated about breaking his heart.
Now, you'd think physics and mathematics were his entire life, but they weren't even his true passions. A reality that would probably shock his modern admirers is that Newton was a hardcore, secretive occultist. He wrote over 1 million words on completely illegal, highly toxic alchemy. For 30 years, he hid out in a smoky shed, mixing incredibly dangerous chemicals and melting metals, frantically searching for the legendary Philosopher's Stone. You know, the mythical substance that was supposedly able to turn cheap lead into solid gold and grant eternal life. And right alongside his illegal alchemy, he harbored a deeply heretical obsession with the apocalypse. Newton firmly believed that God had hidden secret codes about the timeline of human history right there within the text of the Bible. He spent years obsessively calculating the exact architectural dimensions of the ancient Temple of Solomon and analyzing every word of the Book of Revelation. His doomsday math eventually produced an incredibly specific deadline: the year 2060. Yes, 2060 is the exact year Sir Isaac Newton predicted the world, as we know it, will come to a violent end.
This relentless, hyper-obsessive energy eventually led to arguably the most unexpected chapter of his entire life. When he was in his 50s, Newton took a government job as warden of the Royal Mint. Everyone thought it was just going to be a cozy, do-nothing retirement gig. Instead, he basically went full action hero. England's economy was totally collapsing from counterfeit money. So what does Newton do? He puts on disguises, infiltrates highly dangerous London taverns, and personally cross-examines over 100 hardened criminals down in dungeon cells. He brilliantly and brutally dismantled London's counterfeiting underworld. This all culminated in a massive legal battle where he successfully had his arrogant nemesis, an elite criminal named William Challoner, publicly hanged, drawn, and quartered.
So he spends his final decades as this knighted, incredibly powerful dictator of British science, but his personal life? It remained astonishingly bleak. He died a virgin at 84, having never engaged in a single known romantic relationship. He utterly lacked even the most basic social skills. I mean, if he actually invited you over for dinner, he was known to walk out of the room to grab a bottle of wine, get distracted by an equation on his desk, and literally leave you sitting there alone for 6 hours while he just did math. In fact, historical accounts claim he found everyday human life so profoundly joyless that he laughed exactly once in his entire life, and that was just to mock someone who didn't understand a geometry concept. So we have to ask, Why was his behavior so incredibly erratic, so paranoid, and just so extreme? Well, decades after his death, a 1970 lab test finally gave us a physical clue. Scientists got their hands on a surviving lock of Sir Isaac Newton's hair and tested it. The results were absolutely staggering. His hair contained lethal levels of mercury, exactly 40 times the normal human limit. This was the direct, physical result of spending 30 years locked in that secret alchemy shed, constantly inhaling chemical vapors and literally tasting his own toxic concoctions. And when you look at the medical symptoms of severe mercury poisoning, suddenly all the dots connect perfectly. It causes extreme paranoia, severe mood swings, crippling insomnia, memory loss, and total mental breakdowns. All of a sudden, the isolated hermit who jammed a sewing needle into his own eye, the petty tyrant who spent 20 years erasing his rivals from history, and the obsessive detective who sent counterfeiters to the gallows, it all makes total terrifying medical sense. He was slowly, inadvertently poisoning his own mind for decades.
We finish up today with what is perhaps his most famous quote. "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." The reality of Isaac Newton is dark, it's gritty, and it's deeply disturbed. We're talking about a traumatized, abandoned child, a petty and vengeful rival, a ruthless detective, and a poisoned alchemist who held on to secret doomsday beliefs. Yet, without this bizarre, hyper-obsessive, relentless man, our modern understanding of the universe simply would not exist. Which leaves us with one final incredibly provocative question to consider. Is it precisely because of his dark, terrifying madness that he became humanity's greatest mind? Think on that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.
Please like and subscribe.